Prof-It is brought to you by StopToShop.com, and they've got some of the best prices on the internet for the new Emerging Power set. Now's the perfect time to stock up on playable cards like Gothitelle, Pokemon Catcher, Tornadus, or even the new Pokemon Trading Card Game Online code cards. Click on the link in the description to check out the set. When you do, you'll get a 10% discount on your full order at checkout. When you're looking for cards, make the stop. It's Stop to Shop.
Hey Prof-It fans, and welcome to the 50th episode of Prof-It. It's been almost 2 years. I would have never believed that the show has gone this far if you had told me when I first started, but I thought it'd be a good time just to look back at some of the best moments of Prof-It before we get forward to today's episode. So let's take a nostalgic look back at some of my favorite moments from our past episodes.
You're bound to profit from the advice I have to give. Lol, 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 lol. I'm so funny!
Second thought? Let's just get with the episode.
You're Reggie Rocket with the nonsense and my hopes Poke projects. You won't stop till you're about to the top with all the hobbits. Hip with the metagame train, the reigning top kids at the top of his game, and you can't hit my top fist. You want the best tricks? I suggest you profit. You want a mess sprint? I suggest you drop it. Once we started rolling, you know you can't stop it. Let's go and get some lessons from JWittz and Prof-It. Yeah.
Battle Roads this year will start in mid-September, end in mid-October, and I'm surprised that they are so close. Now, your Battle Road might not be for a couple more weeks, but I've got a few local ones that start right on the 17th, and I'm pretty excited. On the other hand, it also means that I need to start looking more at decks, what's going to be played, and what kind of things to watch out for when we come into Battle Roads. Battle Roads are usually a laid-back tournament atmosphere. They usually don't have much on the line as far as a risk, but they're a whole lot of fun, and it's still a good idea to start getting used to a deck that you might want to play the rest of the season. Because this format still has a small amount of sets, the best decks for Battle Roads should still be pretty strong with each upcoming set and each upcoming tournament, so it definitely is worthwhile to hit a few if you can, get used to the tournament atmosphere, have a lot of fun, and improve your skills with some decks. So I picked out 7 of what I consider to be the strongest decks to prepare for Battle Roads, and while some of this is going to be redundant because I've talked about a lot of these decks before, I'm going to try and talk about all of them in the focus of Pokemon Catcher. It's the biggest card by far that came out of the Emerging Power set. It's going to define the format, and I think it's important to look at all these most popular decks and see whether Catcher aids them or harms them as we come into the new tournament atmosphere. So without further ado, let's start looking at some decks. Kicking the decks off is Reshifusion. Reshiram and Typhlosion is a very consistent deck. It's very cheap. It's about medium speed, but it sets up fast enough to get the job done, dealing 120 damage over and over again. I've talked about it before in past videos, but it is interesting because I'm not really sure which side of Catcher Reshiram benefits the most from. Having Catcher is definitely great, and it was always a deck that ran 3 to 4 Pokemon reversals. Usually around 3, just because you don't set up as fast, you don't use it as much, but it still definitely worked with the card. Being able to pull up one of your opponent's Pokemon on the bench and hit them for 120 damage is nothing to slouch at, and combined with plus powers, you could knock out things like a Magnezone that your opponent's building up, or other big Pokemon that you wouldn't think would be unsafe on the bench. However, with Pokemon Catcher, you can just pull them up, deal with them, and it's all over. Unfortunately, Reshiram is also one of those decks that hurts a little bit because Catcher is out too. Now the deck relies pretty heavily on getting out either Ninetales to set up, or Typhlosion to get those energies back once they hit the discard. Both these Pokemon have 60 HP, which has kept them safe from snipe attacks like Yanmega's linear attack for a while now. However, with Pokemon Catcher, they're not as safe as they used to be. Pokemon like Donphan, Cinccino, Yanmega, all those Pokemon that do really quick damage for a low amount of energy can just pull up the Pokemon that you need to evolve and knock them out right away. I think that this will hurt Reshiram a little bit more than it's going to help him, because you really rely on getting set up first before you can get into the game. Now, while this doesn't make Reshiram Typhlosion a bad deck, it's still a pretty good decision. I think that Catcher does weaken it just a little bit. Moving on to another deck that's in a very similar boat as Reshiram Typhlosion is Magnezone Yanmega. Now this is the deck that I played for at Worlds. I liked it then, I still like it now, but it would be kind of foolish if I didn't admit that the deck is hurt a little bit by Catcher. Magnezone doesn't like Catcher, first because it runs those low 50 HP basics, which are knocked out just as easily as the Cyndaquils and Vulpixes that Reshiram will have to deal with, but Magnezone also runs the problem of having a very fat main attacker. By fat, I mean 3 retreat fat. So when they pull him up, you're kind of stuck in the active position if you don't have enough energy to attack with. And unfortunately, the deck usually does get a few Magnezones out so that you can draw a bunch, and you kind of wait and set up your Magnezone behind a wall of Yanmegas doing your early attacks. Now normally this was fine, and with Pokemon Reversal, you didn't get stuck as often. Usually your opponent had to buy their Pokemon Reversals, they couldn't just blow them to pull up a Magnezone, they usually had to use them to get crucial prizes. However, now that you can just get an automatic heads on Pokemon Reversal whenever you want, this could be a problem for Magnezone Yanmega. If you're pulled up with no energy, then you're stuck to be sniped around, or just be knocked out over the course of a few attacks. Also, because they can knock you out before you even set up the Magnezone with Rare Candy, that definitely does hurt. Now, one thing that I did run at World, and I think is going to be a lot more popular as we move into the main tournaments, is Twins. Twins helped David Cohen's deck a whole lot, and he was running Magnezone Emboar. Now, while Magnezone Yanmega is a little bit faster than Magnezone Emboar, you can still fall behind really early now with Catcher. All they need is a Stage 1 Pokemon, a Catcher, and possibly an Energy, and they can knock you out, and you're already on your way to losing the game. However, if you play Twins, it'll at least give you the options you need to get a Magnezone out really quickly. Maybe a Rare Candy in a Magnezone, or one of the 2 pieces that you needed, or an evolution that you need to get back into the game. Maybe a Catcher of your own so that you can take a cheap prize. Either way, I think Twins could be really strong in this kind of deck, and it definitely will help it survive. As far as addressing some of the other things, it definitely does help that the deck has Catcher. It's a very fast deck, and Magnezone drawing a lot is very dependent on both burning trainers through your hand and burning extra cards by getting trainers back with Junk Arm. Because you're already running that full line of 4 Junk Arm and probably 3 to 4 reversals, turning those reversals into Catcher is just going to help you. With all the Junk Arms, you're probably going to be playing somewhere between 4 and possibly 8 reversals in a game, and that's extremely good. You already are running Yanmega, which is still a cheap attacker that does set up very quickly. The only problem is that your main point of focus for both heavy damage and consistency could suffer a little bit if you don't pay attention to where you're attaching your energy and whether or not your opponent's running a catcher-heavy deck. Another thing that I've noticed is a lot of people have started taking Kingdra out of their deck because 101 techs are just hard to focus on. If you're running just a 101, all your opponent needs is a single catcher to knock out your Pokemon, and if that played a big role in your deck, like it did for my Worlds deck, that could definitely hurt you. If you play Kingdra, I would recommend running something like a 2-1-2 or a 2-0-2 line. That way you at least have a little bit more consistency to it, and it can become part of your main strategy without you having to risk it being catchered before you can even get it off. Either way, Magnezone's another one of those decks that does hurt a little bit because Catcher's out. It does help a little bit, but it doesn't get any ridiculous advantages. Next up is a deck that doesn't get help from Catcher at all, and that's Vileplume variants. Now, when I say doesn't get help from Catcher at all, that's just because it probably doesn't run it. However, the fact that Catcher's being played means that a lot of people are going to be attracted to all these trainer-heavy decks, and being able to block those trainers could really help. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt you, though. Obviously, Vileplume decks already had to deal with reversals before you could get a Vileplume out, and now that reversals and automatic heads, you're still suspect to the first 2-3 turns, however long it takes you to get a Vileplume out, where you could still be catchered and be in a lot of trouble pretty early on. Now, Vileplume decks suffer from having one of the worst early games possible in the game. You're just really slow to set up, and you're at the mercy of your opponent's speedy deck. However, it has an excellent late game because you lock your opponent out of all their options and sweep up the rest of the field. Now, there are a couple of different ways to approach decks that use Vileplume, but here are the 2 most popular right now. The first, which I've been talking about for a while, I did a battle video showing what the deck does, I've talked about the deck, I've got the deck list on that battle video, is Ross's deck. Everybody's talking about it, and with good reason. It is a good deck. It's not just a crazy rogue, and a lot of people are all using decks that focus around that Ross engine. Now, as we all know, the card that makes Ross's deck unique is the Reuniclus, which lets you move around damage counters at will, basically locking your opponent out of winning the game or even taking prizes if you have enough heavy HP Pokemon that can afford to just throw all that damage counter away if your opponent can't take a one-hit knockout. Because of this, the Ross variant is extremely popular, and a lot of people are juggling all kinds of Pokemon with 130 HP that can afford to take a hit, and then you can just move all that damage away. The big ones are the ones that Ross already played, including Donphan, Zekrom, and Suicunete Legend, but a lot of people are also talking about running Beartic in their deck. Beartic's from Emerging Powers, and I'm not crazy about the card, but he does do another good job of locking your opponent out of doing things. His attack for 1 water and a double colorless hits your opponent, and they can't attack you on their turn. Now, if they evolve or retreat to a new Pokemon, then they can attack again, but with heavier attackers, Pokemon like Donphan and Magnezone, you're definitely just going to be stuck until you get knocked out if you get hit by 1 attack from Beartic. Now, Beartic is a little bit slower to set up. He does need 2 energy, and one of those has to be a double colorless, but he's got the magic 130 HP, and if you get him out, along with all this other stuff that Ross has in his deck, then yeah, he could be a solid addition to the deck. Now, because the deck has such a horrible early game, it runs 4 twins, not just a few, because it knows that it's going to fall behind right away, and it needs to catch up by getting very specific cards. So, by using twins, you can get back into the game and turn things around. The twins engine has been proven to be extremely solid, and it definitely does help a deck that normally would just fall apart very early on. Now, another popular rendition that used Vileplume was Jason Klaczynski's deck, which was basically a Mew Prime toolbox. He used Mew Prime for a variety of options, the main one throwing a Muck from Undaunted into the Lost Zone, so that you had free will of using your own version of Pokemon Catcher. And that's Muck's attack Sludge Drag, which pulls up one of your opponent's bench Pokemon the same way that a catcher would, but it also poisons and confuses them, which can give your opponent a lot of trouble, especially with decks that require a couple of retreat costs, like Reshiram and Magnezone. Now, aside from also running a very fast attacker, Yanmega, the deck also ran Sunflora to search out all the grass Pokemon in your deck, and an Apom Tech, which would move your opponent's energy to the bench, and possibly locking them out of the game if they had a Pokemon that ran only attacks that required 2 or more energies. For example, you throw up a Magnezone with 1 energy, he could just keep throwing your energy away with Tailcode, and you could never attack with Magnezone, and never retreat him with a switch because Vileplume was down. It's an interesting tech, and it was really cool. However, one thing to note about both of these decks is time. Time is a big factor, and if you play these decks, you have to train yourself to playing as fast as you possibly can. Both of them are decks where you're going to fall behind a little bit early, and you're going to need to catch back up. For example, Ross ended up losing on time in Sudden Death. Now, I know that it was just a 1-to-1 prize game, and David Cohen went first, but putting all things aside, the deck doesn't really have an extremely fast way to attack turn 2. The only chance that you have is attacking turn 2 with Donphan, and that isn't exactly likely. You need to get an energy in one of your just only 2-2 line, and that's not going to happen most of the time. So in Top Cut, if you lose one of your games and end up going to Game 3, you're going to be in trouble, because you're already playing a deck that relies on falling behind first so that you can use your twins. Now, as for Jason Klaczynski, he used his deck to win the Top Cut Challenge, which was an experimental tournament with a bunch of national and world champions across the globe. Now, while he did win, pretty much undefeated, I think, one of the big factors toward this was that they played an untimed event. So he could afford to play a slower game, take a lot of time with his decisions, and he didn't have to worry about falling behind early at any specific point in time. He could play an hour plus for his one single game match to move on, and that gave him a lot of room to work with. Now, obviously, we don't have untimed games. We still have to play 30 minutes plus 3 turns at the end. So if you're playing a deck like this, you do have to worry about setting up as quickly as possible. While other decks do have the option of Catcher now against you, you're still going to get Vileplume out within the first couple of turns, and I think that the decks are still a very strong option. And speaking of slow decks, the last one is one that ended up winning Worlds, Magnabor. Now, once again, I've talked about this deck a lot, specifically because I covered it way before the deck ended up getting re-hyped again after winning Worlds, but we can talk about it a little bit more because the build has changed a little bit. In particular, the deck runs a lot of twins now because it knows that it's going to fall behind early. For example, David Cohen's list, which I posted in that same battle video against Ross's deck, ran 3 twins, which let it get back into games where it fell behind early. However, this deck really suffers against Catcher, and I really worry for its ability to play competitive games. The big problem is that while Magnezone is fat with 3 retreat cost, Emboar is just straight up obese with 4. Now, you just can't afford to retreat 4 retreat cost all the time. And with a single trainer card, you can just pull up an Emboar, leave them active. You can either knock them out and prevent your opponent from having that option toward attaching all the fire energy that they want to turn, or you can just leave Emboar active and snipe around him, whatever you want. Forcing your opponent to retreat for 4 energy is just brutal, and while the deck does run a couple of copies of Switch, you're not going to hit them all the time, and just having that as a huge liability is definitely going to hurt you. Now, aside from that, the deck is pretty solid, and off of Twins, it can set up really well and deal a lot of damage, getting one-hit knockouts over and over again. It also has the option of Rayquaza Deoxys Legend, which can take 2 prizes at a time, while denying your opponent if they can't deal 140 damage on their turn. Now, that's going to be extremely strong against those Stage 1 decks that don't deal very much damage at once, but once again, with Catcher, they can get around you, they can stop you, they can leave you active. It's definitely going to hurt. The deck has traditionally not run very many copies of Reversal. Some just run 0, like David did. But you should probably fit in 1 Catcher or 2, because it is a very strong card. However, as far as how much Catcher hurts versus how much Catcher helps, it definitely hurts this deck a lot more. That being said, it's still going to see a lot of play. It won Worlds, there's a ton of hype around it, and a lot of people already have Magnabore decks built. So you should still be sure to test a little bit against Magnabore and see how it does. In my testing, it's been extremely weak against the new Pokemon Catcher, but see for yourself. And next up is possibly the deck that's getting the most hype in our format right now, and that's Stage 1s. Stage 1s has always been kind of up to the user. There's a whole lot of Pokemon that you can run, and they all have a variety of different options. Most decks usually run Donphan. For 1 fighting energy, you deal 60 damage, you have 120 HP, plus a 20 HP buffer with his Pokebody, which works as basically a defender that's always active. And all those things just make him a very fast Pokemon. He also has that fighting weakness against Magnezone, and if Magnezone always stays popular, then so will Donphan. Now, Donphan's going to love Catcher because it means you can just pull up those basic Pokemon before they evolve and take a cheap prize over and over again. Another classic Stage 1 to run is Yanmega Prime. Yanmega can always snipe the bench for 40 damage, but now with Catcher, you can basically snipe the bench for 70 damage because you can just pull them up and hit them with Sonic Boom. Now, being able to do 70 damage with 0 energy due to his Pokebody is huge. It means you're going to be able to disrupt a lot better and a lot faster. Other popular Stage 1s include Cinccino, Zoroark, Lantern, all kinds of things that have a specific counter in the deck. But most Stage 1 decks run Donphan and Yanmega because they're the absolute fastest Stage 1 Pokemon around, and they're easy to get out, and they've always taken quick prizes. However, with Catcher, the deck really has a field day. Now, one nice thing is the deck isn't really that prone to Catcher either. You're running a lot of free retreat Pokemon, and while they could always pull up your very fat Donphan, Donphan still doesn't mind attacking. It can attack on 1 energy, so it's not like he'd be stuck in the active position. And let's say they bring up your Donphan. Then you could play a Catcher of your own, and probably take another cheap prize with him. You're going to have to be a lot more careful against Stage 1 decks, because they're just going to keep taking cheap prizes throughout the game. Now, unlike those Vileplume variants that we just talked about, or the Magnezone Emboar deck, these decks have a very fast early game, but they kind of dwindle out in the late game. And that's because they kind of cap off at between 70 and 90 damage, depending on the different Pokemon that you run. You're not going to be taking one-shots at the end of the game, so if your opponent does set up something intricate like Vileplume and Reuniclus, you're probably going to lose if the game extends long enough for you to fall down in prizes again. However, the deck's aims to take 6 prizes in 6 turns, and Catcher makes it much more easy to do this. Now, these kinds of decks have benefited a lot more, and potentially the most, as far as decks that like Catcher or decks that don't like Catcher, and they're going to be extremely popular. Now, one thing worth noting is that online, this deck is being by far hyped the most compared to anything else right now. People think that Stage 1s is just too good with Pokemon Catcher, and while I found it to be a solid deck, but not the best deck, most people are going to be running it because they think that it's very easily abusable, and it is. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if either it won the most tournaments or it was the most seen and played deck so far in tournaments, but we'll see from Battle Roads. Anyways, that's just my prediction, and no matter what, I would get some testing in with or against Stage 1s. And the last 2 decks that I'd like to talk about are decks that were either improved or created because of emerging powers. Now, this is a very short list, but it's still worth talking about because these are decks that are receiving a whole lot of hype too. First off is Zekrom. Now, a lot of you guys might be thinking, well, Zekrom was already a deck, so what did emerging powers do? Now, the big thing that it did was add Tornadus into it. Now, a lot of people are torn on Tornadus. Some people think that it's just a card that you should run 1 or 2 of as a Donphan counter, while other people attest to running 4. Some people even run a deck with 4 Tornadus and just 3 Zekrom because they think Tornadus is that much better. Now on paper, Tornadus is not a good card, but as I've said earlier, it does a lot of things right. First, it's a colorless type, which means it abuses double colorless way better than anything else, probably in the format right now. For one double colorless, and just moving one energy over with Shaman, you can deal 80 damage on the first turn, which is pretty easy for getting a donk if your opponent opens with just one basic, and you get to move one basic energy to the bench. Now as I've said, normally this would be bad, but moving that basic energy back to a Zekrom is really good energy conservation. It helps you last in the late game by still being able to hit for 120 near the end, and that alone is pretty solid. Now, having extra Pokemon to start with that can both donk and hit for heavy damage is really good for the deck, in my opinion. Now, in the builds that I've tried low counts and high counts. I think you should run at least 3 Tornadus. It's pretty strong, and once you try it, you'll understand what I'm talking about. If you're running double colorless in the deck, it becomes much easier to get that turn 1 knockout, and that's extremely strong. And that's one thing that this kind of deck has that no other deck does. No other deck can deal 80 plus damage on the first turn before your opponent even gets to draw a card. And plus, with the addition of Catcher, you can knock out whatever you want on that first turn. Having that advantage can be extremely huge, and it's going to make these decks really, really popular. Everybody's talking about them. The addition of Tornadus is just going to help it. It gives it game against Donphan, especially if you're running heavier copies of it, and it just helps you donk on the first turn and conserve energy while still dealing a decent amount of damage. Now, I know that it sounds laughable, and while this deck did perform very poorly in my video that I'm going to show you guys tomorrow with my battle video, it was against one of the deck's worst matchups. Now, that being said, it's worth talking about. The deck's really bad against Trainer Lock variants, especially the ones with Reuniclus. Once they get Trainer Lock and Reuniclus out, your damage is capped at 120, and if they have a Pokemon with 130 HP, you're never going to take that knockout that you need. You'll be stuck, and your opponent will kind of roll you. The deck runs a lot of trainers, is very reliant on using those to get set up very quickly. Catchers, plus powers, dual balls, all that kind of stuff, and if you get Trainer Locked, then you're in a lot of trouble. Now the deck can survive past Trainer Lock by getting those very early game wins, maybe winning in game 3 on a top cut, things like that. But it's definitely not a good matchup, and it's something to consider if you want to play this deck. Otherwise, I found it to have a pretty solid matchup against the rest of the board. So, if there isn't much Trainer Lock in your metagame right now, maybe it's worth playing. And lastly, speaking of Trainer Lock, is the deck that I played against in my video tomorrow that you guys will see, and that's Gothitelle. Now, Gothitelle on its own, in my opinion, is not a good deck. I haven't found it to work in any other scenario other than playing it instead of Vileplume in a Ross-type deck. And you guys will see an example of that tomorrow. But the way that it works is, instead of Vileplume, you now put up Gothitelle, you Trainer Lock your opponent while not Trainer Locking yourself, which is extremely strong. This means that you can still play all those valuable trainers like Rare Candy and Catchers of your own against your opponent, which is great. It means that the deck can benefit from having Catcher while still locking your opponent out from playing theirs. Now the deck does rely on falling behind early, playing twins, setting up, and attacking. It does have the magic number of 130 HP, but its attack does basically 90 damage for 3 psychics and plus 20 for each psychic that you attach. Now, because the deck can't afford to set up slower, once you get enough energies and get the Reuniclus out to stop your opponent from doing anything, basically, you can afford to set up that slow, but it is annoying that you do have to deal with it. Now, once again, this is one of those decks that has trouble in time because it falls behind early, but once it gets set up, it works really well. Personally, I'm not sure if I like this kind of build or Ross's build better. The difference is, with this build, you only attack with Gothitelle, so you only have to worry about getting the 2 stage 2s out. With Ross's deck, you have to get the 2 stage 2s, possibly another stage 1, or a 2 legend piece, or a Zekrom. Now, with this deck, you don't have to worry about all that extra stuff, so it's a lot more streamlined, and you can also play trainers of your own. Both decks are worth looking out. I encourage you guys to watch my video tomorrow to see how a deck like that works. And it's definitely one of the best decks coming out of Emerging Powers. So, with all that, we've got 7 strong decks that have all shown strong performances in the past, and also are going to show strong performances in the future. Now, some of them are hurt a little bit more by Catcher than others, but I definitely think that all these decks will see play, win tournaments, and do well. And I'm also happy to say that that number is 7 decks. Now, I know that beforehand, we only had a few very playable decks, and while Emerging Powers isn't an amazing set, it at least opens us up to a couple more options, and Catcher also makes some of those decks that weren't as strong before a little bit stronger now. Now, I know everybody's still torn whether or not they like this format, but the more that we dive in and get new decks from new sets, the more I like it. Right now, I think it's one of my favorite formats so far, and that's saying a lot. Before Emerging Powers came out, I thought it was kind of boring. It was basically a 3-deck format, and maybe 4 if you throw in Vileplume. But aside from that, things were already starting to feel a little bit stale. As more sets come out, I think things are only going to get better, and it's definitely going to be exciting. Now for a little bit of news, the first is that Battle Roads give you a little bit more incentive to go, and that's because 1st, 2nd, and 3rd place are all going to get a new card called Victory Cup. We actually don't know what Victory Cup does, but it's going to be similar to something like Victory Medal. Now, Victory Medal wasn't an extremely playable card, but it was playable, it was a lot of fun, and it was an exclusive card that you only got for winning a Battle Road. Now that you can get a promo card for getting 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, I think that's just a little bit exciting. They're going to come out as bronze, silver, and gold, trophy cards. And while they're just going to be cards, we don't know what they do. There's a lot of intrigue around them, and I'm kind of excited to get one of my own. It'll definitely be fun, and while the prizes for Battle Roads are still going to be a little bit weak, 4 packs for 1st place, 4 for 2nd, and 2 for 3rd, and 2 for 4th, it's still a lot of fun. They're a great way to get into the tournament season, and I'm excited to hit a couple more this year than I did last year. Also exciting is that the Emerging Powers pack codes that come in Emerging Powers packs are now available for you guys to redeem online to get new cards. Now, I've already redeemed a ton of codes from the boxes that I got from doing well at Worlds, but I've also redeemed a few from random packs that I've bought so far. They're definitely a lot of fun. I think that the online game is just getting better and better, and to give you guys an example, I played Michael Prambuwat, a great player that I almost would never test with before, in an actual competitive online game. He actually proved to be my first loss. I still had Reshiflosion built, and he built Ross's deck, and once you get Suicunente Legend, you just roll the deck. But beyond the details of that, the fact that I can play a highly skilled player that I normally wouldn't have enough connections with to test with is already a reason to get a lot of pack codes, get a deck working, and use that as a way to test. I think that it's just going to grow the game in a lot of ways that we've never seen before, and I'm just very excited for the online program in general. It's a lot of fun. I encourage you guys to check it out and play with it if you haven't already. And I hope that you guys win a lot of Emerging Powers pack codes through the Battle Road season so that you guys can get more packs and play more online. If you see me online, shoot me a message and I'll say hi back. Hopefully we'll get to play a game. And lastly, there is not any official wording on what we've got going on for this season so far. We don't know if the rating system has really changed. We do know that there's going to be separate regionals, but we just don't know the exact tournament structure except for when Battle Roads are. Now, Pokemon usually announces this kind of stuff around September 1st. We haven't heard anything yet, so if I do hear anything, I'll post it as soon as I can on my Facebook page. That's facebook.com/JWittz. Like the page and my post will stay up in your news feed, and I don't try and bother you guys too much. I just write when new videos are coming out, my thoughts about something new about the game, or very important items of news. So if I find out anything about what's going to happen with their tournament structure or anything like that, I'll post it there. If it's a little bit longer than a few days and it comes toward the end of the week, then it'll be the focus of my next episode of Prof-It. Anyways, thanks for staying with me for 50 episodes. I've had a blast making all these videos. Thank you for watching Prof-It, and I'll see you guys over the course of the week with some new videos. Peace.
Champion this year found that Magnezone Emboar has an extremely good matchup against Reshiram Typhlosion, and seeing as Reshiflosion was the most played deck, playing a deck that can beat the